On the morning of October 14, 1887, the quiet of a mill town along the Androscoggin River in western Maine was shattered. A 19-year-old weaver named Abigail Morse was pulled from the shallows just below the dam, her hair tangled with river weed, her left shoe missing. In the 11 months that followed, 3 different men from 3 different corners of that very town would be arrested for her murder. All 3 would be tried in the same small courthouse. And all 3 would walk out as free men. Not one of them confessed. Not one was convicted. And by the summer of 1888, the town itself seemed to have made a silent, unspoken pact: her name was never to be uttered again. So, what happened in those 11 months? Why did every thread of the case unravel in the hands of the men investigating it? And why was this story never written into any official history of the state of Maine? The answer survives, not in official records, but in a handful of yellowed letters, a surveyor's private diary, the payroll ledgers of a shuttered mill, and the loose pages of a coroner who resigned 2 days before Christmas and fled town on the first train out. Before we continue with the story of Abigail Morse, if you are new here, please take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation. And leave a comment below telling us where you are listening from tonight. Your presence matters more than you know, because stories like this one survive only as long as someone is willing to listen. To understand how 3 men could be accused of the same killing and all 3 be set free, you first have to understand the town itself. Because in this story, the town is the 4th suspect and in many ways, the most dangerous one. The town was called Petton Falls. In 1887, it wasn't old, not by New England standards. It had been stitched together in the 1840s around cotton mills built where the Androscoggin narrowed and dropped. It grew the way mill towns grew in that century, in fast, crooked bursts, swallowing farms and pine forests, pulling in whatever cheap labor the railroads could deliver. By the time Abigail Morse was born there in 1868, Petton Falls had close to 4,000 residents. 2 large mills, a canal, a company store, 3 churches, 4 saloons. But the population was split, with almost no crossing, between the old Yankee families who had owned the land before the mills and the 3 waves of newcomers the mills had brought in. There were the Irish, who had arrived first during the hungry years and now held most of the skilled positions on the looms and in the machine shops. There were the French Canadians who had come south from Quebec in the 70s and 80s, whole families at a time, often speaking no English, taking the lowest paid work in the weaving rooms. And there were a smaller number of Scots and Cornish, brought in as overseers and engineers, because the owners trusted them not to mix with the rank and file. The 4,000 people of Petton Falls lived in the same town, walked the same muddy streets, and drank from the same river. But they did not marry each other, did not worship in the same buildings, and did not, as a rule, tell each other's secrets. The town had a particular sound, one that anyone who lived there would carry in their body for the rest of their life. It was the sound of the falls themselves, a low, continuous roar that came up from the river day and night. Layered over that was the sound of the mills, a deeper, slower thrumming that started at 5 in the morning with the first whistle and did not stop until 9 at night. On Sundays, the mills were silent, and the falls were all you heard. The old people said you could feel the difference in your chest, the absence of a weight you hadn't known you were carrying. The weaving rooms themselves, when you stepped inside them, were a different climate altogether. Hot and humid in summer to keep the threads from breaking, kept damp in winter by steam pipes that hissed along the ceiling. Loud in a way that made speech almost impossible, so that the women who worked there had developed a whole language of gesture and lip reading and shouted single words. You could always tell a weaver on the street by the way she leaned slightly forward when spoken to, and by the way she answered, with her mouth formed more carefully than other people's mouths, as though every word had been shaped for someone who could not quite hear. The mill itself sat at the center of everything. It was owned by a man named Silas Bridgham, who had inherited it from his father. He lived in a tall white house on a hill above the dam, where the water noise never stopped. Silas Bridgham was 61 years old in 1887, a widower, a deacon in the Congregational Church, and the single largest employer for 40 miles in any direction. He was also, as nearly every sworn statement in the later investigations would note without quite saying it, a man accustomed to being obeyed. He had large, pale hands that he kept folded when he was listening. He listened a great deal. And when he spoke softly, so that people leaned in to hear him, which was, those who dealt with him often said, part of how he worked. He was not a cruel man in any ordinary sense. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike his servants. He gave generously to the church and paid for the annual orphans' Christmas dinner out of his own pocket. He was, in the phrase used by his pastor in a eulogy delivered 16 years later, a pillar. But pillars, as anyone who has stood beneath one in an old building knows, bear a great weight, and the weight presses downward. And what is beneath them is often the thing that is never questioned. His son, Ezra Bridgham, was 24, unmarried, home from 2 years at a business college in Boston, and widely expected to take over the mill within the decade. Ezra was taller than his father, better dressed, and possessed of a laugh that people in Petton Falls heard often in the saloons along the canal on weekend evenings. Although he was never quite drunk, because Ezra Bridgham knew precisely where the line was. He had a reputation among the girls in the weaving rooms, and that reputation was not a kind one. There were stories passed in whispers in the boarding houses and over kitchen tables in French and Irish and Yankee English about girls who had been cornered in stairwells. About girls who had been offered rides home in the Bridgham carriage and had accepted, and had not spoken of the ride afterward. About a girl 2 years before who had left town abruptly to live with an aunt in Rutland, Vermont, and had returned 10 months later, thinner and quieter, with a look in her eyes that the women in the weaving rooms recognized without needing to name. But the reputation stayed inside the weaving rooms. It did not climb the hill to the White House. It did not, before that October morning, find its way into print anywhere in the state of Maine. Abigail Morse worked in the No. 2 weaving room on the second floor of the South Mill. She had been there since she was 13, as her mother had been before her, and her older sister Mercy still was. The Morse family were Yankees, not Irish and not French, which in Petton Falls mattered in ways that were never spoken of directly but organized every aspect of daily life. It meant they had a small clapboard house of their own on the edge of town rather than a room in a boarding house on the canal. It meant Abigail had gone to the district school through the 6th grade and could read the Bible and write a clean hand. It meant when she was killed that there were people willing to ask questions, at least at first. Abigail's father had died in a logging accident when she was 11, crushed beneath a log that had rolled off a sled on a steep hillside above the river. Her mother, a quiet woman named Hannah, kept the family alive on the wages of her 2 daughters and a little piecework sewing she took in at night. There was no money for doctors, no money for a lawyer, no money for the kind of pressure that could hold a rich man's feet to a fire. There was only, as Hannah Morse would write in a letter that never reached its address, a mother's memory of a daughter who had been, in her mother's words, bright and watchful and too pretty for her own safety in that town. Abigail was, by the accounts of the 3 women who worked the looms beside her, a serious girl. She was not flirtatious. She did not go to the dance halls on the canal. She saved her wages in a tin box under her bed, a box her mother would open 3 days after her funeral and find to contain $43.11, a sum that had been nearly 2 years in the accumulation and that had been meant, though Hannah Morse did not know it yet, for a specific purpose. Abigail was, in the autumn of 1887, engaged to be married quietly to a young man named Michael Thibodeau, a French-Canadian machinist 2 years older than her. He had saved enough to rent 2 rooms above a cooper shop. He was, by every account, steady and gentle and devoted to her. The engagement was not announced. Her mother approved of Michael, but the wider Morse family did not because he was a Catholic and French and not their kind. And Abigail had learned at 19 that some things were easier to do than to explain. They were going to marry in the spring, after the roads dried, and they were going to move to Lewiston, where Michael had been offered a position at a larger mill, and where no one would look sideways at a Yankee girl on the arm of a French boy. They had a plan. They had a future. The $43 in the tin box was the down payment on a small house on the outskirts of Lewiston, a house Michael had already walked past 4 times and described to her in letters Abigail read by candlelight in the small room she shared with her sister. On the afternoon of October 13, 1887, Abigail finished her shift at the No. 2 weaving room at 7 minutes past 6. She punched her card, said goodnight to her sister Mercy, and walked out into the dusk with a shawl over her hair and a tin lunch pail in her hand. Mercy Morse, who would survive her sister by 44 years and would speak of that evening only twice in all the years that followed, remembered that Abigail had seemed tired, but not unusually so. She had asked her to tell their mother that she would be home by 8, and had walked out by the canal gate rather than the main gate, which was slightly unusual, though Abigail sometimes did this when she wanted to stop at the small dry goods store on Water Street to buy thread or ribbon. It was the last time Mercy saw her sister standing. She was never seen alive again by anyone who would later admit to seeing her. The Androscoggin River in October is cold. The water comes down from the lakes already dark, and by mid-month the nights drop below freezing, with a skim of ice forming along the quiet shallows by morning. On the 14th of October, the sun rose at 6:06. At 6:30, a boy named Cyrus Fournier, 12 years old, was walking his father's 2 milk cows down to the river to drink before the first bell. He saw a shape at the edge of the water just below the dam, where the current curled back on itself and made a slow pool behind the old grinding stones. The shape was long and pale and did not move. The boy would remember for the rest of his life the particular way the morning light had looked on the water, a flat gray light with a little pink in it where the sun was coming up over the pines on the east bank, and the way his breath had come out in a cloud that hung for a second before drifting sideways. And the way the cows had stopped a few yards short of the shape and had lowed, not loudly, but in a sound he had never heard a cow make before, a sound that made the hair stand up on his arms before he understood what he was looking at. Cyrus Fournier dropped his switch and ran. He ran past the cows, past his own house, past the cooper's shop where Michael Thibodeau had just lit the stove. He did not stop running until he reached the constable's house on Elm Street, where he pounded on the door with both fists and told the constable's wife, in a mixture of English and French, that there was a dead girl in the river. The constable was a man named Horace Pellier, a French-Canadian who had been on the town payroll for 9 years and who was, by the common judgment of Peton Falls, a decent and not especially clever man. He had a slow way of speaking and a slower way of thinking, and both had served him perfectly well because the problems he was ever called on to solve were problems that had already been settled by someone else before he arrived. He arrived at the river at 6:45 with 2 deputies and a doctor named Ephraim Haw. Dr. Haw was also the town coroner, a position he held by vote of the selectmen and for which he was paid $12 a year. He was 57 years old, a widower for 6 years, with 1 grown son who had gone to divinity school in Bangor. He had a small practice that supplemented the coroner's fee, and he owed, as of October 14, 1887, a debt of $420 to the Bridgham Mill Company, a debt incurred by his late brother 3 years before and for which Dr. Haw, as the only surviving family member of means, was legally responsible. The debt was not yet overdue. It would not come due for another 11 months. This fact is important, and we will return to it. What the 4 men saw when they pulled Abigail Morse from the shallows was recorded in 3 separate documents, and the 3 documents would not agree. The constable's log said simply that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water, fully clothed except for her left shoe, with no visible injuries other than a bruise on the left temple consistent with a fall against rocks. Dr. Haas' initial notes, written in pencil on the back of a pharmacy receipt and later copied into his private diary, said something different. They said the bruise on the temple was too clean, too localized to have come from tumbling among river stones. They said the fingernails of the right hand were broken and packed with fibers that looked like wool, dark wool, the color of a man's coat. They said the clothing, when removed at the undertaker's shed, showed tearing at the collar and waist that had not come from water. They said there were marks on the inner wrists that could have been made by the pressure of a strong hand, and a line across the throat, faint but present, that could have been made by the edge of a forearm held there too long. And they said something else in a line Dr. Hall later underlined 3 times. They said the body had been in the water for no more than 6 hours, which meant Abigail Morse had not gone into the river on the night of the 13th, when she finished her shift, but sometime after midnight. After 5 hours she could not be accounted for 5 hours when she was somewhere in that town with someone alive. Word of a drowned mill girl moves through a mill town the way smoke moves through dry pine. By 9 in the morning, the looms in the number 2 weaving room had gone silent. By 10, the news had reached the machinist's shop, and Michael Thibodeau had fallen to his knees on the floor and had to be carried out by two of his countrymen. By noon, a crowd of perhaps 200 people, mostly women, mostly French and Irish, had gathered outside the undertaker's shed. By 1 in the afternoon, Silas Bridgham had arrived at the shed in his carriage, had spoken privately with Dr. Haw for 7 minutes, and had left. What was said between them was never recorded. Dr. Haw's diary for that afternoon contains only 3 words, written in a hand that the man's own son later said was not his father's ordinary writing. Those 3 words were, "He knows already." At this point, if you are finding this story as unsettling as we are, do us a small favor. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling us what you think happened to Abigail Morse. And share this video with someone who loves a mystery that refuses to rest. Your engagement is what keeps these forgotten cases from disappearing a second time. And now we continue. The first arrest came 6 days later. His name was Patrick Gallagher. He was 28 years old, an Irish loom fixer who had worked in the South Mill for 11 years. 3 weeks before Abigail's death, he had been involved in a public argument with her outside the company store. The argument had been witnessed by at least 6 people, and its subject had been, according to every witness, Michael Thibodeau. Patrick Gallagher had, in the blunt language of the weaving rooms, been sweet on Abigail Morse for more than a year, and had been displeased to learn from a cousin of hers that she was engaged to a French boy. 3 weeks before her death, he had approached her outside the store on a Saturday afternoon, when the street was full of people, and had said something angry, something about her being too good for a papist, something about her throwing herself away, something about her regretting it. And she had slapped him in the face in front of everyone. He had walked away with his cheek red and his mouth working. On the afternoon of October 19th, Constable Pellier arrested Patrick Gallagher at his boarding house on the canal and took him to the town jail. The charge was murder in the first degree. Gallagher, according to the constable's own account, was drunk when arrested, though not violent. He did not resist. He said only, over and over, as the constable led him down the stairs, that he had not done it, that he had been with friends on the night in question, that they would swear to it, and that he wanted a priest. The trial began 4 weeks later. It lasted 3 days. The prosecution called 8 witnesses, 4 of whom testified to the argument outside the store. Dr. Haw was not called. His written report, entered into evidence, said only what his official log had said, that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water with a bruise consistent with a fall. The notes about the torn clothing, the wool fibers, the marks on the wrists, the line on the throat, these were not in that report. Dr. Haw had written a second report, a clean one, sometime between October 15th and October 20th, and the second report was the one the court saw. The defense, paid for by a collection taken up among the Irish workers, called a single witness, a woman who ran a boarding house on the canal, who swore that Patrick Gallagher had been in her common room playing cards with 4 other men from 7 on the evening of the 13th until past 2 in the morning of the 14th. The 4 other men were called. They confirmed it. The details were consistent. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Patrick Gallagher was acquitted on all counts and walked out of the courthouse into a cold November rain. The second arrest came in February of 1888. His name was Jonas Chadwick. He was 42 years old, the overseer of the No. 2 weaving room, which meant he had been Abigail Morse's direct supervisor for the last 6 years of her life. He was a Cornish immigrant, unmarried, and lived alone in a cottage on the mill's property. The new evidence claimed he had been seen walking with Abigail along the canal path on 3 separate evenings in the 2 months before her death, at hours when the weaving rooms had long since closed. The evidence was presented by a 14-year-old Doffer boy who swore he had seen Abigail crying on one occasion, and Chadwick walking close beside her, speaking to her in a low voice. Jonas Chadwick was arrested at his cottage at dawn on February 9th. The trial began 3 weeks later. On the second day of the trial, the boy did not appear. A deputy sent to his parents' boarding house returned with the news that the boy was gone, that his family said he had left for an uncle's farm in New Hampshire and that they would not be able to produce him. The prosecution had nothing else. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and returned a verdict of not guilty. Jonas Chadwick returned to Petton Falls, packed his belongings into a single trunk, and left on the evening train to Portland. The boy was never seen in Petton Falls again. The third arrest came in August of 1888. Its announcement was met in Petton Falls with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but resembled a long exhalation of held breath. The accused was Ezra Bridgham, the son of the mill owner, 24 years old, heir to the White House on the Hill. The evidence against him had come finally from Dr. Ephraim Haw in the last week of July. Dr. Haw, now 58 and visibly ill with the stomach cancer that would kill him the following spring, had walked into the office of the county district attorney carrying a leather satchel and had placed on the district attorney's desk his original pencil notes from October 14, a copy of his diary, and a signed affidavit. The affidavit ran to 4 pages and laid out with methodical precision exactly what he said had happened. It said he had falsified the coroner's report in October under pressure from Silas Bridgham, pressure that had taken the form of a conversation in his parlor during which Silas Bridgham had reminded him, without ever raising his voice, of the $420 debt owed by his late brother, and had mentioned that the debt could be either forgiven in full or called in full. The affidavit said the debt had been forgiven on November 1, 1887, in writing, by Silas Bridgham's own hand. It said the bruise on Abigail's temple had been inflicted before her immersion and was consistent with a blow from a man's fist. It said the torn clothing and wool fibers under her fingernails indicated she had fought her attacker. It said the marks on the wrists and throat indicated restraint and suffocation. And it said finally that he had reason to believe the attacker had been Ezra Bridgham because Silas Bridgham, when shown the body, had not asked any of the questions a man who did not already know the answers would have asked. Ezra Bridgham was arrested at his father's house on the evening of August 3. The trial began on September 11, 1888. It was the most closely watched criminal proceeding in the history of Oxford County to that date. Reporters came from Portland, from Lewiston, from Augusta, and from as far as Boston. The courtroom held 112 people and held on the first day closer to 200, with the overflow standing against the back wall. The prosecution was conducted personally by the district attorney. The defense was conducted by a 3-man team from Boston, led by a criminal lawyer who had never lost a murder trial. Silas Bridgham had spared no expense. Every pillar of the prosecution's case was pulled down. Dr. Haw, under cross-examination, was questioned for 11 hours across 2 days. He was made to admit he had lied under oath and accepted a bribe. The housemaid who had testified against Ezra was revealed to have been dismissed for theft and had been overheard swearing revenge. The night watchman who had seen Ezra on the canal path disappeared the day he was scheduled to testify and was never found. Michael Thibodeau, Abigail's fiancé, was forced to admit he had publicly sworn to kill Ezra Bridgham with his own hands. Silas Bridgham himself took the stand and spoke for 45 minutes without ever raising his voice about his son, his mill, his town, and his deep sympathy for the young woman's family. He wept once, briefly. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Ezra Bridgham embraced his father in the front row of the courtroom. The Bridgham family left by private carriage that same night. Dr. Ephraim Haw died of stomach cancer 5 months later. On his deathbed, according to the son who was with him, he said only, over and over, in a voice barely a whisper, "They are all paid." What did he mean? It's the final question this story leaves us with. The pattern, when you lay the 3 trials side by side, does not look like justice failing. It looks like a machine working exactly as it was designed to work. In the first trial, the witnesses who alibied Patrick Gallagher all lived in a boarding house whose mortgage was held by the Bridgham Mill Company, and that mortgage was forgiven in full after the trial. In the second trial, the boy who would have convicted Jonas Chadwick disappeared, and his parents were moved into a house whose rent was paid by the mill. In the third trial, the night watchman vanished with money he couldn't have saved, and the housemaid was found hanged in a rented room in Portland. None of these facts, taken singly, proves anything. But taken together, they reveal something older and quieter and more terrible than a conspiracy. They reveal a town, an entire town, tacitly agreeing that a certain answer could not be arrived at because the answer would require the town to dismantle itself. The bargain was simple: you may have wages and houses and schools and a church, and in exchange you will not ask who it was she fought before she died. The payment was not only in money. It was in silence. And the silence had been accepted, and the acceptance had become indistinguishable from the town itself. Abigail Morse was buried on October 16, 1887, in the Yankee Cemetery at the north edge of Petun Falls. Her stone is small, white marble, and reads only her name, her dates, and the words "taken early." Her mother lived another 19 years and never remarried. Her sister Mercy worked in the mill for the rest of her life. Michael Thibodeau left Petun Falls and never again spoke the name Abigail aloud, though he kept a photograph of her in a small wooden box until the day he died. Petun Falls itself did not survive the century. The mills closed. The population fell. The White House on the hill was torn down in 1954. Today, it is not on most maps. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the third man was the killer? Or is there a fourth possibility we have not yet considered? Do you think Dr. Haw told the whole truth at the end, or only as much of it as he could bear to say? Was the historian who uncovered this file truly a victim of a tragic accident, or did the long arm of a dead mill town reach out one last time to close a hand it had been holding shut for more than a century? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten crimes pulled from the archives of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that refuse to stay buried. The dead do not rest when the living refuse to remember them.